A man stood at my grafting bench last spring, holding 2 scion cuttings from the same tree. He wanted to know which rootstock to put them on. He expected one right answer. There is not one right answer. There is a decision, and it is made before the knife ever touches the wood. And most people who graft their own trees never sit down and actually make it on purpose. I am Hollis. I've been grafting trees on this ground since I was a boy, walking behind my grandfather with a bucket of wax. The rootstock decision is the one I watch people skip more than any other, because the scion is the exciting part. It is the variety. It is the flavor you already know you want. The rootstock just sits underneath, doing the quiet work, and it is the part that actually decides whether that graft becomes a tree you are glad you made. Here is the mechanism worth understanding before anything else. A grafted tree is 2 separate plants joined at one cut. The scion above the cut becomes the fruiting wood. The rootstock below the cut becomes the entire root system that tree will ever have. The rootstock governs vigor, mature size, how well the tree tolerates dry ground, how it takes to training, and how soon it comes into bearing. Change the rootstock under the same scion, and you change nearly everything about how that tree behaves for the rest of its life. I test my own trial block against this every season. I put rootstock in the ground roughly 10 to 12 years ago on this same patch. I grafted it myself and trained it myself. It is producing well now. Good size, good shape, a solid crate count off nearly every tree. I keep that block specifically so I never have to guess. I can walk out and show a visitor exactly what a given rootstock choice actually becomes once it matures, rather than repeating something I only read somewhere. This matters because a lot of the confusion around rootstock choice does not come from bad information. It comes from good information applied without context. Somebody hears that a certain rootstock delivers strong production and assumes that applies everywhere on any soil, at any elevation, with any watering schedule. It does not. The same rootstock behaves differently on a wet valley floor than it does on a dry slope. The only way to know for certain is to watch it on ground similar to your own. That means several real seasons, not one good year. The conversation also changes shape depending on what fruit you are grafting. Apple rootstocks are graded almost like a size chart, from strongly dwarfing up through full size. Stone fruits such as peach and plum tend to work with fewer, more vigorous rootstock choices, and the size range between options is narrower than it is with apples. Whatever fruit you graft, treat the rootstock question as its own decision for that species, not a single rule you carry over from the last tree you grafted. Let me walk through what I actually weigh before I graft a single tree. Because the order matters, and skipping steps is how people end up with a decision they regret 10 years in. Number 1, how much ground do you actually have? This is the first question, not the last one. A full-size or semi-vigorous rootstock wants room. Given open ground and no space constraint, I lean toward the more vigorous option nearly every time. A vigorous rootstock is more forgiving of an imperfect year. It also gives you more structure to train into whatever shape you eventually want. The fix here is honest measurement, not hope. Walk the actual planting site and measure the mature spread you are planning for. Choose a rootstock rated for that spread, rather than picking the one you like the sound of and pruning hard every year to force it smaller. A tree fighting its own rootstock's natural size is a permanent chore, not a one-time correction. Number 2, what your water situation actually looks like, not what you hope it will be. Dwarfing rootstocks like M9 need continuous, reliable watering. They do not tolerate a dry stretch the way a more vigorous rootstock does. A more vigorous rootstock, such as MM111, handles drought conditions far better and can go through a dry spell without the same stress, though it still needs water on a limited schedule, never none at all. Get this backwards, and the cost shows up as a stressed, underperforming tree during the exact years it should be settling in and building strength. If you cannot commit to steady irrigation through your dry months, choose accordingly before you graft, not after the tree is already struggling in its second season. Number 3, are you planting new ground or converting an older orchard? These are 2 different decisions and I treat them separately. New ground with no history gives you a clean choice based purely on space, water, and training goals. An older orchard with storm-damaged or aging trees is a different situation entirely, where trees have broken limbs from snow or age and are no longer worth nursing along. That is often the moment to act. Remove them and regraft fresh rootstock in that same spot, rather than continuing to prop up wood that has already done its work. When I convert an older block, I choose the variety against the site's actual elevation and exposure first, then match the rootstock to that variety's needs. Skipping that order is a common mistake. Picking the variety because it is fashionable, without checking whether it actually suits that elevation, is how a converted block underperforms for years before anyone traces the cause back to the original choice. Number 4. What training system you intend to use. Tall spindle, central leader, and multi-leader systems all place different demands on a rootstock. A dwarfing rootstock suits a tall spindle system well, producing an early, manageable tree that responds quickly to that kind of training. A more vigorous rootstock still works with central leader or multi-leader training, but it asks more of you in the early structural years to establish the shape you actually want. Decide your training system before you graft, not after the tree is already 3 years in and growing in a shape that fights whatever system you eventually choose. Changing course later costs you real structural wood you cannot get back. Number 5. Whether the pairing has a track record you can actually see. I do not commit a whole planting to a scion and rootstock combination I have not watched perform somewhere first, ideally on my own ground. My trial block exists precisely, so I have a place to check before I ever graft that pairing at scale. If you do not have your own trial block yet, find a neighbouring orchard or a trusted grower who has run that same combination for several years. Ask directly how it has actually performed, not just how it is supposed to perform on paper. This single habit prevents the most expensive mistake on this whole list, which is grafting an entire planting onto a pairing that only looks good in a catalogue description. Number 6. The pruning habit that quietly delays first fruit more than any rootstock choice does. This is the part almost nobody connects back to their rootstock decision, and it deserves real attention. When a young grafted tree gets a heading cut, meaning the main leader or a branch tip is simply cut back hard, the tree responds by throwing vigorous upright water shoots near that cut. Those water shoots are not fruiting wood. They are the tree pouring its energy into vertical growth instead of into the lateral wood that would eventually carry fruit. I have watched growers wait 4, 5, even 6 years for a first sample off a tree that was otherwise perfectly healthy. The actual cause traced straight back to repeated heading cuts. Those cuts pushed the tree into water shoot after water shoot every single season instead of fruiting wood. The fix is straightforward once you understand the mechanism. Avoid heading cuts on young wood. Let the branches extend and develop naturally instead of cutting them back hard each winter. Where water shoots do appear, and some always will, regardless of technique, remove anything longer than about 6 inches rather than leaving it to compete with the rest of the tree. That single habit rebalances the tree's nutrition back toward the branches you actually want producing fruit. In my experience, it is far more responsible for a slow orchard than the rootstock underneath usually gets blamed for. Number 7. Matching density and expectations to the rootstock you actually chose. A dwarfing rootstock supports closer spacing and can be trained more intensively without crowding itself out. A more vigorous rootstock needs more room between trees to avoid the canopy closing in on itself before the trees mature. I have walked blocks planted too tightly for their rootstock where quality and consistent sizing suffered. The trees were simply shading each other out. It had nothing to do with soil or variety at all. Set your spacing at planting time based on the mature size that specific rootstock actually reaches, not a generic spacing number pulled from a different planting entirely. Number 8. Whether you have actually planned for staking before the graft ever goes into the ground. A dwarfing rootstock generally carries a smaller, shallower root system, and that shallow system does not anchor a full-grown, fruit-loaded tree the way a more vigorous rootstock does on its own. That is not a flaw. It is simply the trade-off that comes with the smaller size. A dwarfing tree left unstaked, or staked once at planting and then forgotten, can lean hard or go over completely once it is a few years in and carrying a full crop through a strong wind. Decide your staking plan at the same time you decide your rootstock, not after the tree is already 3 years old and struggling to stand on its own. Some dwarfing rootstocks genuinely need permanent support for their whole productive life. Building that into your plan from day one costs far less than trying to correct a leaning, established tree later. Number 9. Keeping an honest written record of what you actually grafted and what it actually did. I keep a page for every rootstock I graft. Variety, rootstock, planting date, training system, and then a line every season on how it actually performed. Not how I expected it to perform, how it actually did. 5 years in, memory alone is not reliable enough to make the next decision from, especially once you are grafting several different rootstocks across a growing planting. This record is what turns one season's result into a real trial rather than an anecdote you half remember. It is also what lets you catch a rootstock quietly underperforming on your specific ground before you have committed an entire new block to the same pairing. Number 10. How your actual soil drainage matches what that rootstock tolerates. Heavy, slow draining ground asks something different of a rootstock than light, sandy ground does. Some rootstocks handle wet feet through a rainy stretch far better than others, and a rootstock that thrives on a well-drained slope can sit unhappy in ground that stays soggy after every storm. Walk your planting site after a real rain, not just on a dry afternoon, and notice how long water actually sits before it drains away. If your ground holds water for more than a day after a heavy rain, that alone should shape which rootstock you choose, separate from everything else on this list. Skipping this step is how a tree can be planted with every other decision made correctly and still struggle. The reason traces straight back to roots, sitting in water they were never suited to handle. Walk the site first, with a tape if you have one, and write down the real available spread for every tree you plan to graft. Be honest about your irrigation reality for the growing season ahead, not your best intentions for it. Decide whether this is new ground or a conversion of an older block. If it is a conversion, choose your variety against the site's elevation and exposure before you choose the rootstock underneath it. Pick your training system on paper before the graft goes in, and choose a rootstock that actually suits that system, rather than forcing the training to fit a rootstock chosen for other reasons. If you have any way to see that exact scion and rootstock pairing already growing somewhere, go look at it in person before committing an entire planting to it blind. And once the graft takes and the tree starts pushing growth in its first 2 seasons, resist the urge to head it back hard. Let it extend. Walk it every few weeks through the growing season. Pinch out any water chute past about 6 inches before it has a chance to steal the season's energy from the wood that will eventually carry your fruit. If the rootstock you have chosen is a dwarfing one, put the stake in on the same day you graft, not sometime after the tree starts leaning. Write the pairing down before you forget the details, and start the season-by-season record while the tree is still young enough that the first entry actually means something. If you are converting an older block, rather than planting new ground, walk it first and mark which trees are worth top working and which have simply reached the end of what they can give you. Choose the replacement variety against your actual elevation and exposure before you ever settle on the rootstock underneath it. The variety decision should come first on a conversion, with the rootstock chosen afterward to support it. Check your drainage the same week after the next real rain, rather than waiting for a dry spell to pass judgment on ground that only shows its true nature when it is wet. Match the rootstock to what you actually saw standing in that soil, not to what the ground looks like on a good day in the early summer. None of this takes long to work through properly. An afternoon walking your own ground with a notebook will tell you more than any general rule ever will. Your ground, your water, and your climate are the only variables that actually matter once you are the one holding the graft in your hand. Nobody else's orchard has to live with the choice you are about to make. Yours does, for as long as that tree stands. I keep a written rootstock guide for my own trial block, covering exactly how each rootstock I graft actually performed here, year by year, not how it was described when I bought it. It is linked below if you want a starting reference while you make your own decision. It exists because I got several of these choices wrong myself early on, and I would rather hand you the shortcut than watch you learn it the same slow way I did. That man at my bench left with both cuttings grafted onto different rootstocks on purpose, once we had actually talked through his ground, his water, and what he wanted that tree to become. Neither choice was wrong. The mistake would have been picking blind, taking whichever rootstock happened to be sitting closest on the bench and grafting it without ever asking whether it actually suited his ground. I still see him most seasons. He walks out to that tree before he asks me anything else, and by now it is doing exactly what we planned for it to do, because the plan came before the graft instead of after. So before your next graft goes in, walk your ground first and decide on purpose. The variety gives the tree its name. The rootstock decides whether it becomes the tree you actually wanted or one you spend the next 10 years working around.